Hi, and welcome to Work Together, a podcast brought to you by SocialOptic. SocialOptic offer tools and expertise, empowering organisations to gain critical insights, make informed decisions, and work together better. In this podcast series, we ask experts in their field for their views, thoughts, and advice on topics that we encounter with organisations and leaders, ranging from technology and data science to organisational culture and psychology. Roll intro. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the topic of employee wellbeing. Joining Benjamin Ellis is Zelda Franklin-Hills, Director of Organisational Development and Human Resources at Fife College. Zelda discusses Fife's journey of employee wellbeing, the importance of strategy, and their challenges and learnings along the way. Let's dive in.
The even harder thing is, what is the impact? So actually, in terms of impact, how do you measure that in the organisation? So you could measure things like your sickness absence, your turnover, and those types of things. But actually, that doesn't necessarily mean that your wellbeing programme is working.
So today's topic has become one of those hot topics, I think, in the last couple of years. But the reality is it has a longer history. And so today we're talking about well-being. And I am delighted today to have Zelda join me, who we have worked with here at SocialOptic for a long while and brings a wealth of expertise. So Zelda, I'll let you introduce yourself to the listeners.
All right, so I'm Zelda and I work at Fife College and I'm the Director of OD and HR there. So I'm responsible for the people strategy, the writing of it and the implementation of it. So wellbeing firmly kind of falls into my remit, and I'm kind of excited to share my experiences and thoughts around wellbeing in the workplace, and certainly in a college sector, but maybe wider than that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what you have done, I think, just for the context of listeners, has been externally recognised in terms of those things there. So it really is a privilege to have you here. And probably the place to start is actually, what do we mean by well-being? Because it seems to kind of end up in every single LinkedIn post and dropped into every single strategy at the moment. But yeah, I'd like to step back and go, well, how do we define well-being? What do we mean by that in an employee context?
So I think that it's a really interesting question. What is well-being? Because it's hard to divorce well-being in workplace and well-being for the person, I think. So at Fife, we've kind of started to look at it in terms of kind of four pillars. So those four pillars are around emotional, social, physical, and financial. So to kind of cover that whole remit of well-being. Sometimes people think, well, why would you include financial? But I think this latest economic crisis has kind of told people why financial is important and why it can affect your well-being. Because if you don't have enough money compared to what your outgoings are, that can be really worrying for people. And when I think about those four pillars, and I think about, emotional is not just about how you're feeling, but it's also about your resilience and your self-awareness and how you manage positive and negative emotions and feelings. And I think about social, and I think social is also really, really important as we come out of COVID and all the things that have happened there. So it's about interactions with others. It's about connectedness. I think it's about conflict resolution and how you do that. I also think it's about things like how you adapt to change. So it's quite broad for me. And physical is, I think, which is one of our third pillar, is about managing health. It's about prevention, but it's also about improvement. And financial, well, we talked a little bit about that, but it's about, do people manage their finances well? How do they support budgeting? Are there things that we can do that can help in the workplace? So it's not just necessarily about your salaries, but it could be things around, can we give extra benefits? Can you, join groups where they'll offer benefits and money off for certain things? Can you do salary sacrifice? So there's kind of a whole range of things that can come in under financial. For me, those four pillars make up the well-being of a person, but also the well-being for someone in the workplace.
I really like the model, because a lot of the approaches to well-being from an individual point of view are obviously kind of very individualistic, although actually even that is shifting. I still have a slight hand in the self-improvement space, and it's been interesting to see the narrative shift there to even in that domain start to think about it more as a social context. But yeah, I think that model in the workplace of taking into account not just the individual factors, but that the social and the environmental pressures around it as well is a really nice, robust model. I like it. It's like simple and clear, but it covers all of the different attributes. Because I think trying to pick off well-being as an individual responsibility and exercise, which has been a little bit of a strain in some workplaces, I think doesn't get to the heart of the matter, really. As I say, particularly we've got a lot of customers in healthcare, and there we're really seeing cost of living, the economic factors are very significant to people's well-being, because it is a constraint on what they can do and how they can live. So I like it. So how does an organisation get started with well-being then? If we kind of recognise at leadership level this is something we want to do, where do you start as an organisation with well-being?
For us, we were very much thinking about it in terms of the impact of COVID and how that left people feeling, but also because it's important for us to put people at the centre, and that we knew that we would be moving into different ways of working. So I think you've got to kind of think about, well, what are your motivations for well-being, and why do you want to do it, and where are your levers? So what is it that you want to change? So if I think about Fife College, we had COVID, and that kind of started that conversation. But also we know that we are an ageing population, and as we age, well-being can change for individuals and people, and that can be through people you have to care for. So you might change from caring for your children to caring for grandparents. You might change to caring for your parents in those situations, or even a loved one. So all of that can impact on that. And as I'm talking about that, I'm thinking that was another impact around COVID and how that changed for some people. Their family structures may have changed through that for different reasons. We didn't really have an issue around things like turnover or absence, or any of those types of things. So those weren't necessarily the drivers for us. So we've got a range of different roles and people in the organisation, and I think that also impacts how you want to think about wellbeing. So we have people in offices, we have people in classrooms, we have people in prisons, because we deliver a learning services contract in the Scottish Prison Service. So we have a range of people. We have people who are peripatetic and they go out, so they spend more time out than in. And we're starting and have been on that journey of smarter working and agile working. So where do we want to work? And all of those things led us to think about well-being. And I think those are all the types of things an organisation would need to think about when they think about their well-being journey, and what do they want to change, or what are the issues that they've identified around well-being that they need to think about.
It's very helpful that there is you starting with the people, both in the broader social context and in terms of the makeup of your organisation. It's interesting how organisations I've worked with over the years do come to those points where either brought in a new intake of graduates, and that shaped the organisation and the issues, or kind of parenting related things have become an issue, or they've got an aging population with lots of people coming up to retirement, and they're looking to extend the accessibility of the workplace for those people to retain that talent. And it is interesting that you have to start with, well, what are you working with, because the need's going to be quite different. I think when I first came across wellbeing, which was a long time ago, back in my days of working with IT, it was we've given you a gym membership, there you go, which even for me as a non-sporty IT person probably didn't best address my health and wellbeing needs at the time. It's interesting that that's starting with why. I mean, tell me a little bit more about that, not necessarily the Fife specifics, but that's quite a different approach, because that's quite a strategic approach to wellbeing, whereas a lot of what I see can be quite tactical or programmatic. And in talking with you, one of the things that came out was quite a different perspective really on addressing wellbeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an organisation, the question why in wellbeing is really, really important. So the question I would always ask, what is the purpose of doing something around wellbeing for us as the organisation? That's the question I would ask. And what is it that we want to change? And why do we want to change that? So we were quite clear, as you say, as you said, we were quite strategic in our thinking and why we wanted to do that. And then there's been other layers as we started to think about it that we've kind of brought in. So we knew, for example, that we would have more flexible working. So now we started to think about that in terms of smarter working and moving away from the binary choice that we were having of you're either at home or you're at work. So now with us, we're developing again, thinking about, and how does that then support wellbeing? So that for me is the key thing in an organisation. What is it that we want to address? Why do we want to address it? And what do we want out of that? How is it going to help us to do the things as an organisation that we need to do? And I think you're right. Sometimes there is this temptation to say, right, okay, well, we need to do something on wellbeing. So what we'll do is we'll run some events and we'll label those events as wellbeing, and then that's doing wellbeing. It absolutely is, but that's not in a thought necessarily in a thought out wider strategy over a period of time. And so what you might get, like you say, Benjamin, is I get some gym membership, which might be suitable for me. I mean, it might not be for you, but it might be, or you might do something else. So you might run some occupational health kind of advice and sessions that people can go. But if that's not in a strategy and that's not focused on something, you might end up with a bit more of a scattergun approach and spend quite a lot of money and not actually ever change the well-being of your people in the way that you want to do, or support them in their well-being, perhaps rather than change it, although sometimes you will change it for people. So that would be what I would think about. And I think, that bigger strategy piece is really important, because what that then does is it really helps you get the investment that you need and the right amount of investment. But it also helps you then to describe how you're going to measure some of that. Measurement's important.
Love that you use the term investment there, because sticking my board hat on for a minute, having sat on boards, oftentimes people bring initiatives and say, this is what we want to spend on this, which is always one of those moments where you tear your hair out slightly sometimes, maybe, as a board member. But actually somebody can say, well, this is what we want to invest in, and this is why, and this is the impact we expect from it. And effectively embedded in that, here's how we will measure success. Like, that's what you want to see as a board member. Is going, okay, this makes sense. We're taking this money. We're not just throwing some fun events. This is actually an investment that's going to achieve these outcomes that is going to improve the organisation. I think sometimes people can be a little bit shy on that with wellbeing, because it's a good thing to do and there's a social good to it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to make commercial sense, and it doesn't have to have measurable objectives.
Yeah, and I think one of my reflections in terms of our sort of HR strategies is we did put in some outcomes and we did think about that. But I think the better way of looking at it, and we didn't do enough of it, we absolutely didn't. And I know, as you said, we have won awards and things, but I would recognise there's always weaknesses in what you can do, and there's always things that you can improve upon. So that would be one of the areas. And I think for me, we always struggle in HR to think about how are we going to measure this? What are our results? What are our outcomes? Sometimes the even harder thing is, what is the impact? actually, in terms of impact, how do you measure that in the organisation? So you could measure things like your sickness absence, your turnover, and those types of things. But actually, that doesn't necessarily mean that your wellbeing program is working. You need to think about, do our staff feel more well against your 4 pillars or whatever it is that you've decided on? So I'll give you a lovely story about impact and outcomes. So this is not about wellbeing, but when I worked in another organisation, we were looking at women in the workplace and women getting promotion, and also why they weren't. So we decided that we would invest and have a programme to support women to get promotion. And actually what happened is most of the women who participated in the programme didn't get promoted, they left. So if you were to look at kind of, well, was that successful or not? You could say, well, no, it wasn't, because everybody left. But the reality was those that left went on to much bigger roles in other organisations than they probably would have got in our organisation. So that, it is about how you think about it and the impact. So you could say the impact was pretty poor for that organisation, but actually it wasn't. It was really great for those individuals.
Yeah.
So it's how you think about all of these things. We haven't, and as I'm saying, I haven't got that right in the organisation. We're still thinking about that. That will be one of our developments as we start to think about, right, okay, we've been doing wellbeing, we've got the strategy, that strategy is here for a time. What else?
Yeah, and it's interesting, the balance of measures, because people often jump to the analytics, which is a good starting place, turnover and those sorts of things. They are very laggy measures in terms of they fall behind, and they're very vulnerable to confounding factors, to external ones. So it's interesting that as we're building a body of data, actually the attitudinal measures, how do you feel, how do other people around you feel, actually they're leading indicators, because you see those moving more quickly. But the other piece of that is that those attitudes do directly move into performance, and that's something we're seeing more and more because of the linkages between how people are feeling, the time off that they may take related to that, or even if they don't, actually just the drag that gets introduced to teams sometimes. If a team member is not at their best, actually the radius of the impact on that is quite significant in the organisation, a lot more than people realise. It's not just like one ripple out, it's a couple of ripples out, and something's changed, but you don't know why. And it's because there's somebody struggling with one of those dimensions of well-being. So actually addressing it, you see the changes in the attitudinal measures, but we see the other things follow in terms of relationship with the manager, understanding what the organisation is about. All these other measures move, because actually if somebody is struggling, they're unlikely to be engaged. They're unlikely to be managing their team well if they're managing a team. So it's a very direct impact from that attitudinal measure to what actually happens in the organisation. And well-being is, I think one of the things I've seen move the dial most rapidly on those things. I think partly because it shifts the relationship, or the perception of the relationship between the employee and the organisation, because it is a way of saying we care and demonstrating that we care, which is one of those things that changes employee engagement.
Yeah, and actually when you were talking there, as organisations get leaner, which some are, as a result of the situations and economies and downturns and things, you might find that you're more reliant on single people in one post, because you've only got a person, because you can't afford to have more than that in an organisation, and therefore their well-being becomes really paramount. And particularly, like you say, if something's not right, then if they're the sole person in that job who does that in that organisation or in that part of the business or in that location, that can become really quite important. So yes, you're right, that kind of engagement and that attitude, and how you help people to feel more engaged and positive towards their employer can reap benefits in those kinds of environment.
You've moved the ball into one of our hot topic areas here at SocialOptic, which is something that has been I wouldn't say a heated debate, but potentially a controversial view. So I come from a systems engineering background, and in systems engineering, resilience is about system design, not component design. And so I take that into the organizational world in terms of a lot of people talk about resilience as being an expectation of an employee, whereas for me, resilience is how you design the roles and organization around them. And there is this pull between resilient systems and efficiency, and that's the trade-off. If you want a resilient system, actually there has to be effectively excess capacity to deal with system failure. That, from an engineering point of view, that's what you have to do. There's been a little bit of a kind of push into resilience being an individual responsibility rather than an organizational one. And it's interesting, I think I've seen a few things, I think like Bruce Day is talking about this a little bit now, like the pendulum's moving the other way now, but for a period of time there was like, we're going to train you in resilience and it's your responsibility to get through this stuff. And I know that's very different to your view, but yes, I can resist kind of putting that one in there, that there is that thing about very lean organizations. You've got to be aware that there is a balance there between resilience and running an organization incredibly lean, and that they're not compatible.
Yeah, and we have to be quite careful with resilience, because I might be able to cope with quite a lot of things, and therefore be seen to be quite resilient, but that might not be the case. I might just be coping, but appear quite resilient. Or other people, you might, you can be very judgmental about resilience too. So something happens, Ben, and you go, I can't cope anymore, and I go, I'd have been able to cope with that. And that's the problem when you think about resilience. You can bring your own judgment into those things, but really the reality is, when we're in the workplace, you only know the person that you see in the workplace. You don't know what else is going on if they don't share. And all of those things affect how resilient a person can be.
And I like going back to your 4 pillars model, where things become a significant issue, it's very rarely one axis of pressure. I mean, it can be, but usually what's happened is things are coming at that person from multiple angles, and one thing is just the last thing. And so one is being aware that you're going to get different responses from people potentially in the same role that are not necessarily individual differences. There's situational differences. If somebody's dealing with family bereavement, or quite dramatic shifts in the childcare provision, any form of external stressor, or the money is not meeting the bills, you've got a base level of stress in there. So actually small things in the workplace can be catastrophic. If you've got somebody else who's like, all's good in the world, they've got money saved up in the bank, and everything is just rainbows from the other dimensions, they can cope with a lot happening in a situation that somebody else might not. And one of the things about well-being that I think is not immediately obvious is that preventative thing. If you're helping to move all of those dimensions, so in your context in the 4 pillars, actually, that is a way to tackle resilience, where you're not making it the individual's responsibility, you're giving them capacity to deal with what comes up.
Yeah, but I mean, even and that can be really difficult, because some of the things around, if you think about the 4 pillars, financial is one of those that people don't talk about. I mean, we don't talk about money very much anyway, but to ask people in the workplace to start to talk about, well, actually I'm in hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of debt because I'm not great at budgeting, and I don't really, I'm living beyond my means. That is not a conversation that is going to happen that often in the workplace. Yeah. And certainly not with managers. So one of the things, and that's one of the areas where we've thought quite a lot and had to think quite hard about what we do. So we do have links with a kind of local community bank, and that's great because that supports that bank. So people can save for Christmas, people can do those types of things, but also they can get loans. And if they use that community bank, then that's helping other people in the community to use that. So we're kind of, through some of these things, you can support other initiatives that support other people who are not connected to the college. So that's really good. But there are, when we think about financial, we ran a session in one of our festivals to look at finances and how people do that. And our first kind of experience of that was not many people went. But what we then said is, right, okay, well, why aren't people going? Well, probably because they don't want to talk about it. So then we said, right, okay, what people can do is anonymously put in questions that they have around finances. And then one of our team can put that to the expert, and then they get answers and people can then listen. We recorded that, and then people can listen and they go, well, that was my question, and actually that was an answer, and that then might lead them to feel more comfortable to talk about, right, okay, well, that was really interesting, I now need to go and get some more advice about that. So and we've tried quite a lot of different sessions around the 4 pillars, and some are really good and some get lots of attendance and some aren't, because they are more taboo subjects. And so we've run sessions around cancer, and they've been really well received and well attended, but some of our other sessions on more sensitive subjects haven't been. So you kind of we have to think quite hard about how we deliver some of that. And I think, so going back to that question of resilience, it is about how do you get people to engage in some of the areas where it might be affecting their resilience in the workplace or even at home, in areas that they wouldn't want to talk about with their colleagues. Yeah,
I think we'll come back around to that aspect as well, because maybe we explore that now. There is that thing that a lot of the topics around well-being are very personal, and there is that question both from an organisational point of view and an employee point of view. So, well, where do these boundaries exist? And one of the things that has been highlighted with the changes from working from home is kind of shaking those boundaries up a little bit. But it is that question, well, what is personal stuff? What are people comfortable talking about in the workplace? What are they not? And where, particularly as an employer or as a leadership team, where does your responsibility extend to? Because there are going to be things that are very personal to that employee that are not going to be things within the organisation's control necessarily. Cancer being a very good example of that.
I know that whole boundary thing is a really difficult one. If I think about a person, though, a human being, well-being there's no boundary in well-being when you think about that. And so when I think about what we need to do as an organisation and as a college, it is, for me, how do we support people perhaps to have some of those things, conversations with people that they feel uncomfortable with, and you need to maybe offer a range of different things. So I've talked about festivals and those things that we do, but also how do you enable people to access information which might be about stuff they don't want to talk about in the workplace, and that will be probably individual for those people. I mean, we can universally say people don't like to talk about their finances at all in their work or at all, but that the level at which they talk about that might change. So for some people, they might want to talk about it at work if it really is having a huge impact on them. So boundaries, I think, are quite difficult. I would definitely go with the human. There isn't really a boundary in a human. So it is, how much do we offer as an organisation to support people, and what does that look like? So information, sessions, employee assistance programs, maybe champions of things. So you could create kind of networks and champions of people. So an individual doesn't have to talk to a manager. They could talk to somebody who's trained to do that, or somebody in the organisation who's willing to listen to someone and help. There are multiple ways of doing it, and I think you have to provide multiple access points. But the more that you talk about these things in your organisation, the more that perhaps people will want to talk about them too. And so therefore those boundaries get even more blurred, and that can only be helpful. You know, if somebody thinks that maybe they have something that perhaps isn't right with them, perhaps they're not feeling very well, but they're worried about maybe going to a doctor, or they're worried about going to talk about that, wouldn't it be great in an organisation if they could find someone and say, look, I am worried and I don't know if I want to go to the doctor because I'm worried about that, and they could get some support to do that, which would help them to get an early diagnosis. Getting an early diagnosis probably will support them much better than waiting for a long time when the prognosis may not be so good, no matter what that is.
Interesting. There are, obviously there are individual differences around that, and that's always been the case in terms of cultures that people have been brought up in and those sorts of factors. But that actually there is a company or organisational culture aspect to that, and I'm thinking about some organisations, some sectors we work with, they're very competitive cultures. And so people talk about something that might be perceived as a weakness is like within that organisational culture is no, nobody's going to do that. And so for them, it's been quite a shift to get to the point where I feel like I can safely talk about these things. So there is that bit of shaping organisational culture to create the context for those conversations. So it's interesting to hear as well that can be done quite programmatically. I like that idea of giving people other people to speak to other than their line manager that they might not be comfortable speaking to, just to enable those conversations to happen and get people access to the resources that they need.
Yeah, and culture is important to create that kind of to create a really good well-being environment. Where it is talked about, where it is part of what everybody does and as part of what a manager and an individual might talk about. I think for the college, the other reason why wellbeing is important is that kind of crossover when you talk about boundaries with our students. So, and usually our clients are in the campuses all the time with us. So that's quite unusual. In a bank, they might come in and then they'll, a customer will come in and walk out. Whereas our learners are with us maybe every day, every week of their course. So that's kind of different for us in terms of our boundaries and how we think about wellbeing, because if your clients are always there, then they're always there with your staff who are experiencing potentially and your colleagues' issues. So how do we deal with that? So alongside our wellbeing for staff, we obviously have students at the centre, and we have quite a lot of wellbeing services. But the other reason why I feel that's quite important is because our learners will be employees of the future and employers of the future. So if we can show them what a great wellbeing culture is, or a great culture, that can only serve the whole of our community better and the whole of our workplaces of the future better. So boundaries are really interesting. I'm sure there's a whole topic in that.
That's a great illustration of just great social value. And I think just putting that in context for people, we work with lots of organisations in the healthcare domain, and there you have sometimes an even more, again, it depends on the nature of the healthcare, the service being provided, but quite often your patients will be there. And actually for the employees, as they come in every day, actually that patient is a big part of their working context, and that patient is by definition unwell. That's why they're in the service. Yeah. So that's the kind of one extreme through to where you've got a student population on campus and that level of contact. But actually there's a continuum that every organisation exists on, because one of the things I often look at is how much customer or service contact is there for the organisation and different parts of the organisation, because that shapes where you're going to get flex in culture. But for every organisation there is some form of contact, and it might not be the customers or the users. So I think about for a software as a service business, for example, actually there's not a lot of contact with the users. There's not a big impact on the employees. Some of the support folks might have chats with them, but the developers would never have it. However, in those organizations, the balance shifts to the impact of the suppliers that they work with, and actually the well-being of the suppliers. So there is some domain of influence on those external factors, and sometimes it's either the organization's responsibility or a good idea to reach over those barriers a little bit and share the resources, even if it's at the level of, here's something we've done as an organization, might work for you, might not, but here's how we approached it.
And social value is important. So one of the things we did in our sort of first year of real wellbeing festivals was we ran a wellbeing conference, and anybody could come along to that. So it didn't matter, you didn't have to have an association with the college. You could come because you had seen it on LinkedIn or you'd seen it somewhere, and you just needed to register. And that was really good for the college. So we had a lot of people who came because it was the first time they'd been to the college or the first time they thought about the college. A lot of different organisations came. So sometimes those types of activities are really good for your PR too. So they're not just good for the well-being of staff, but they're good for social value. They're good for your reputation. They're good for all those other things. So it's about how do we think about those things in that broader strategic context, not just I'm doing some well-being, so that's great.
And I think that's a good thing maybe to come around to end on, which is how do you take a long-term view on well-being? Because it's always initially going to end up being quite programmatic, because you've got to start somewhere. But from where you are now, what would your advice be, or thoughts on how do you take a long-term approach to it? Because it's not a job that's ever done, is it, really, well-being?
No, absolutely it's not. And even if you've done it for a person, something will happen to the person at some point in the future. So you'll be looking at well-being and supporting them again, because that's the nature of life and interaction and part of being a human. So we very much took the view that we would write our wellbeing strategy and we would have it over a sort of 4-year period. And when we looked about it, we kind of took that very phased approach. So our first year was really about let's have an introduction to wellbeing, let's run some events, let's do some things. And then our second year is let's embed some of that thinking and let's get feedback from people to support that embedding. And then I think our kind of next year, which is the year that we're in now, is around about what new initiatives can we do? What new thinking's coming up for us? Where, what are other organisations doing? Kind of being a bit curious about some of those things. So one of the things we've done is introduce, for example, a coaching service. So that you might think, well, what's that got to do with wellbeing? So that's really just maybe coaching people for an issue that they have around how they do things in the workplace. But actually, no, the coaching service is about supporting people to in any aspect of their working life or any aspect of their life. So it's about what can we do and constantly thinking about that. And then I think in our final year, which will be the year after next, and bear in mind we work on an academic calendar rather than a calendar year, for us it will be about engaging with the staff even more than we have been, and saying what's worked, what's not worked, what do we want to do, and then also thinking and having conversations with our board and our people and culture committee to say how are we going to better measure the impacts, how are we going to better do those things. Because I also think we run wellbeing festivals, quite a lot of those things, we've got quite a lot of things in place now. But I suspect that over time, they may get stale for people. Not another wellbeing festival, where they're going to do something on menopause or they're going to talk about whatever. How do we make that fresh for people? So we do engage all the time with people who attend and also people who don't. But I think that's that kind of phased approach that I think you need to have. And you do need to have dialogue with the people and your colleagues who may be attending events, but it's really key that you also engage with people who are not. And that can be quite challenging, because obviously if they're not engaging in the festivals and then you come along and say, well, I'd like to engage with you about what you're not engaging on, then that is a challenge. But it's about how do we do all of that? So we talk to the unions, for example. One of the big challenges we have is that we've got a group of people who work on a timetable because they're in classes. So how do we make sure that the events and things that we hold are at times when they can engage as much as people who perhaps have a bit more flexibility like myself can? All of these things got to be thought about. But I think having a long-term strategy, having a real vision about your purpose, what you want to achieve, what the outcomes are, and setting that in a 2, 3, 4 year framework, and constantly reviewing and thinking what's new, researching what's new out there, what can we bring in, what are we learning, being open-minded. So that kind of curiosity is really important, and looking out with of your sector. So we all, I don't know about you, but I find quite a lot of organisations only look to their own sector. So if we've got a problem, we'll go, what are other colleges doing? What are other universities doing? What are other people doing? But actually, maybe the question should be, what is that really large organisation doing, that bank that's international? Or what is it that small company is doing, so that you can be curious and look out?
Yeah, it's like a slow version of agile. I mean, that's the principle of agile: is you make your steps, you do your measurement, you learn and iterate. It's doing that at a bigger loop, I guess. Do that over a 2, 3, 4 year period, because it does. My observation on wellbeing is it does take quite a while to work out what is working well and what isn't, because there are so many different factors in. It's like, just because somebody's not engaging doesn't mean that that's not working. That could be a culture barrier, organizational culture barrier. Haven't quite hit the right point to get people to engage with that. It doesn't mean you've got the wrong mechanism. You just might need packaging differently, or actually maybe you have got completely the wrong mechanism. So it is quite a slow process to figure out what of these things are working, and then pick apart, well, why did that not work maybe quite the way that we thought, or why didn't that have the impact that we thought? I do like that idea as well of going to covering both groups, those people engaging and those people who are not, to give you that kind of understanding, because there's always a danger with these things that you change something trying to improve it, and end up removing the thing that was good about it, which always makes it challenging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we have, one of the things that I'm going to be really interested about is about our participation rates, because we have around about 49% participation rate. But I do worry that if we continue to do some of the things that we're doing in the format that we're doing, then we might see that participation drop off. And it is just constantly asking yourself questions and looking at your data and looking what things are telling you, and using your employee engagement survey data to tell you things, and looking at everything that you've got, and using your community groups if you've got them, using your wellbeing champions, whatever they happen to be, to kind of get that information to help inform your longer term vision. Because I think wellbeing needs to be seen over a period of years, not just something I'm going to do today and then it's okay. So a bit like agile working or smarter working, we're moving away from that binary choice of home or work. And then I can see that developing even further. So it's not just homework, but it could be any campus and any college. But then we might start to say, well, actually, it could be anywhere. And we provide you the equipment to do that. So I think these things are evolutionary. You need to see it like that. But you've got to start somewhere. That's my other thing. Get your strategy, get your purpose, think about it, think about what you're going to do over a long period of time, get that investment, persuade people, and then really show them through outcome and impact how it's making a difference.
I like that. That's very sage advice to end on. Thank you so much for your time today, Zelda. It is appreciated. You sharing your wisdom with us.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Work Together, a podcast brought to you by SocialOptic. If you aren't already subscribed, search for SocialOptic Work Together on your favourite podcast service. And if you found it helpful, don't forget to help others find the podcast by giving it a rating, leaving a review, and telling others about the show. You can find more from SocialOptic on our website, socialoptic.com. If your organisation would benefit from data-driven decision-making and desire to work better together, then get in touch through the chat box on our website. Drop us an email or give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. You can also read more on our blog, where we explore more of the themes we discuss on the podcasts. This podcast was hosted by Benjamin Ellis and produced by me, Chris Trim.